Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. European leaders appear to be recalibrating their global partnerships as relations with the United States grow more unpredictable, with renewed outreach to China and a landmark trade deal with India. Are the UK and the EU actively diversifying away from Washington or simply hedging their bets? Well, to explore this question, we're joined by Tomasz Włostowski, he's managing partner at EU Strategies and a regular contributor. Tomasz, welcome. Thanks for taking the time, as always. So, I'll ask you that question. Is there a strategic pivot by the EU and the UK away from the US towards India, China and Mercosur?
Well, I think clearly, I don't know if it's a strategic pivot, but I think clearly the unpredictable trade policies, and not only trade policies, but also the defense policies of President Trump and this U.S. administration, they're really forcing, I think, reluctantly, the EU and the UK. And, you know, in case of UK, I think that's very reluctantly, because, I mean, the UK, of course, is famous for its special partnership with the United States. So I have no doubts that there's last thing the UK wants to do, but be pushed away from the US and look for this partnership somewhere else. Of course, the UK has always been a free trading nation. It's got historical relationships all over the world. So clearly, and that was part of, I think, of the Brexit story, right? We can leave the EU. We have our relationships elsewhere. We can leverage them. That, of course, changed, I think, now with the Trump administration, because, you know, it's a lonely world out there actually without the EU and the US. So these other relationships are quite important. And of course, China is extremely important to global trade, to finance, and also as leverage against the US as well, because I think I don't know if President Trump realizes this, but I'm certain that his administration realizes this, that the US has no leverage to actually push China where it wants China to be, without having that vast networks that the US always had. So without the EU and without the UK on their side, it's going to be very difficult for the US to push.
Right, and of course, India is another big leverage that he could have used against China, but India seems to be moving more towards the European Union, having signed this deal. Let's go back to the UK for a second, if we may. What are the contours of what each side is going to get from the other?
Well, I think for the UK, well, number one is the UK needs trading partners. Needs trading partners that will, on the one hand, replace the vast trade relationships they had with the EU, because Brexit, of course, has consequences. So the trade with the European Union is affected. It's decreasing. It's becoming much more difficult. And part of the Brexit story was we're going to expand our trade with all the other regions. So, and obviously China is the big, sort of the big market out there that everybody wants to conquer. Of course, the tendency is just the reverse, because the Chinese have accepted a lot of imports, but now they're pushing everybody away as they're building up their own industry. So that market's becoming more and more difficult. You know, China has also become a big source of investment and of technology. There are a lot of areas where the Chinese have really jumped ahead of the Western world, in particular in all these technologies related to climate policy. So the classical example are EVs, solar panels, even wind turbines, in which the EU was better. But obviously this investment from China will be important. It's also a big export market for the whole world, including the UK. I understand that part of the big item on the agenda was Scottish whisky, which was negotiated down to 5%. So I'm sure the Scots are happy. Yes. So I think that's it really. And for China, there's a number of big wins. The first one is to show to the world, but also to the United States, you will not determine our relationship with everybody else. That's number one. Number two, you're increasingly alone. We are. This is what the Chinese say, of course. We're a free trading nation, which of course is not true, but at least that's what they're portraying. We are interested in a stable global order. Of course, that's not fully true as well, but at least they can portray that. We're interested in international organizations that you are leaving. So actually, the Chinese story, and we're also interested in fighting climate change, which is also a big, I think, item on the agenda.
Are they though? I mean, they haven't signed up to any international agreements.
Well, no. Look, no. China is very pragmatic about how it decarbonizes. So they are still building coal-powered energy plants, but they're also the largest, by far, investor in renewables. In renewable technologies, in all the sort of carbon-free technologies. So China is doing everything, actually. So they're much more pragmatic than the rest. So China has a lot to offer, both to the EU and to the UK. And I think the UK, but also the EU and also the other regions, will be using the possibility of building that friendship to send a signal to the US, look, if you don't want to play ball with us, we have other options.
Right. Now the only thing that concerns many is that a relationship with China comes with strings. We've seen this across Africa and in Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that are, so what will China expect in return for perhaps opening up their market or investing in the UK and or the EU?
Well, it depends who we're talking about, because of course the Chinese, they fully understand how the world works, so they understand they can request more from some countries and they can request less from the others. I think in case of the UK and the EU, the big items on the agenda are actually don't interfere in our stuff. I think this
politically.
Well, politically, I think a relationship with Taiwan and so having as less interference in that relationship, what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea, the Uyghurs, right? So Xinjiang, human rights violations. Essentially, the more they can keep the West out of interfering in those affairs, keeping quiet and showing that actually, look, the West is cynical. They're just here to do business, as everybody should. I think the Chinese government would be happy, and also they would really want both the UK and the EU not to align with the US in building that pressure on China, because the US is, as we already discussed, it is not going to be powerful enough to force China if it's US versus China and the whole world is standing by. So of course, right, as long as the Chinese can isolate the US, I think that's a big win for them.
Yeah, the more they can do that, the better. Now, how does that fit in with the relationship between China and Russia? Because of course, Europe, EU, UK are all supporting Ukraine, and Russia's kind of relying on China for a lot of their oil sales. How do you square that kind of dynamic?
Well, absolutely, and this is the difficult part of the equation, because if it wasn't, I think, for the very substantial support that the Chinese are giving the Russians, the story of EU and UK approximation with China would be much easier. I think this will be a very hard pill to swallow, especially for countries in Central Europe. I think, and for the UK as well. I don't think as long as China continues that support to Russia, that approximation between both the EU and UK and China is going to be difficult. Though I think there's also one more point I should have mentioned, which is the other thing that China might want, at least from some EU member states, is acting as sort of a stop in internal EU decision-making when sanctions are coming up, when some policies that China might not be happy about, they can always call up a couple of capitals in Europe and say, look, we've got this wonderful EV investment in Hungary, for example, and we really don't like this measure, so can you do something about it? So. Right. Obviously, they're playing on a number of pianos, as we say.
It certainly seems to be. I mean, and that perhaps is of concern, because Russia seems to be doing something very similar with Hungary in terms of the influence. Now, let's move on to the EU-India deal. Talk us through what that's all about.
Well, Donald Trump, I think. Well, that's the short story.
Yeah.
I mean, there is another agreement. If we look at what's been happening in the last half a year or a year, we had two long-standing negotiations that were not really going anywhere with Mercosur and with India. With India, it's another long one. 19 years it's been negotiated. India is sort of in the world trade policy, it's always depicted as a very protectionist country, very high tariffs, cars, 110%, very sensitive about its agriculture. So an FTA with a free trading region like the EU, we like to consider ourselves free traders, that agreement's always been very, very difficult. And I think the fact that we accelerated it in the last, let's say, in the last year. The fact that India, from what I understand, because we haven't fully seen everything that's in the text, but the fact that India has been willing as well to significantly lower its tariffs, because around 96% tariffs are eliminated or committed to be eliminated. So that's a massive amount of trade, and I don't think anybody really expected India to concede so much. So I think it's clear for both that both EU and India decided that they can win a lot by pushing this free trade agreement forward. India also needs to play its game with Donald Trump, with the Chinese, and I think it works for both sides.
Yeah, I mean, India has always also presented itself as being neutral. You know, it refuses to be tied down to one side or the other. But this deal does tie it, bring it much closer, doesn't it, to Europe?
Well, I think does it bring it closer to Europe? It does. I think the relationship with Europe's always had a lot of potential, but it wasn't fully developed. I think the relationship with Russia, India's relationship with Russia was closer. With China, of course, the trade is incredible as well. The EU has always been somewhere, it's far away. I mean, let's be honest that logistics, transportation cost is always important. So I would say that that EU is entering this game. It's not that the EU will have a privileged relationship with China over the other partners, but I think this is part of India being really playing to a number of audiences at the same time and trying to build up the EU as a credible, reliable partner as well, in addition to the partners India already has.
Now, the other thing, and this is common both to India and to China, is Russian oil, which both of them are buying in enormous quantities. India's refining it and then reselling it back to Europe. I mean, again, there's a conflict here, isn't there? I mean, you know, on the one hand, the EU is sanctioning Russian oil. On the other, they're dealing with countries that are buying. Trump was talking about secondary sanctions on India and China. Mm-hmm. So it's all a bit mixed up, isn't it?
Well, it's true, but I think we also need to understand. I mean, India's, it's a huge country, right? It's a huge country. Of course, it's pursuing its own energy policy, and of course, it needs energy. A war between Russia and Ukraine and Europe's position on it, from India's primary interest, I mean, that's a war that's really, really far away, right? And I can understand India not being, to have that consideration somewhere on, of course, in its decision process, but it's not the main consideration that there's a war in Europe and the Europeans are sanctioning.
No, but from the European perspective.
From the European perspective, yeah. It's very important. But I do need to point out, from the 21st of January, I think importation of refined petroleum products made of Russian crude is forbidden. So that thing is already taken care of. So EU will not be, or at least should not be, importing refined petroleum from India based of Russian oil. Of course, there's a question about how effective that ban will be and whether there will be a transshipment. But I think the EU is basically trying to find a scenario where it can send a signal: look, we are expanding our trade with the US. Our sanctions are in place, so we're not importing Russian oil, we're not importing your products from Russian oil, but on everything else, we're happy to cooperate and let's expand this relationship, in particular because India is also very interested in having international trade rules that the EU wants to have.
Tomasz, as always, the clock has beaten us. So much more to talk about, but thank you for coming along and sharing your analysis. It was great to see you in the studio.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.